and each subdivision could be further broken down as well. And what's very handy about having these larger paddock divisions with further subdivisions is it allows you a lot of flexibility to be able to do things. So, for example, if you want to give up an area and hay it, you want to clip an area, you have a big enough area to get into for equipment, and it gives you a lot of flexibility to be able to move your pastures back and forth between grazing and clipping management or haying management by having major subdivisions that are further subdivided. I think that's going to be the basic. If you don't remember anything else from pasture layout than this, it's that you want to have a lot of flexibility in your pasture layout so that you could bring in large equipment and you could hay it, or you could use that large equipment easily. And you can be flexible as far as your allocations of animals. In other words, let's say you've got beef animals and you're not milking every day, so you're gonna go away for 3 or 4 days. Well, instead of moving them every day, you want to have a paddock that's going to be good for 3 days. Well, if you have larger areas and you can give them more with a poly wire, you can give them a larger area for those 3 or 4 days. And so that whole idea is to have some flexibility there. The rule of thumb for typical Wisconsin operators, no more than 250-foot wide pastures are a good starting point. So if you're going to put divisions, large divisions in your pastures, and you want to do strips, probably 250 feet wide is your widest. And the reason for that is, as you get out with your poly wire, managing 300, 400, 500 foot of poly wire takes a lot of work to set up with post. As long as your pastures are long, 250 feet is a pretty good sense to get equipment in and out. So, for example, if your hay bond is 16 feet, 15 feet, somewhere around there, you can get a good number of passes up and down that pasture. And if it's a long pasture, it works out fairly well. You want to place, if you're going to be doing pressurized pipe, pressurized water systems, you can place your pipeline down the center of every other field, thereby with shutoffs, thereby at every 300 feet, thereby you can have tanks that run on both sides of that pipeline, depending upon where the animals are. And your couplers are usually 300 feet because that's the length of plastic pipe. We'll talk more about the pipeline systems in the engineering session during our last session, but just to give you an idea of when you do your pasture layouts and show where your pipelines are going, basically you want to go down the center of every other field. That way you can have a field on each side. If your fields are large and square and you have a large herd, sometimes it's best to put a more of a permanent tank in the center of the field, and there you would have pipelines just under the surface down the middle of the pastures. But it more or less depends. That's when you get into very large pastures with large herds. Lanes or trails and walkways are lost acreages. So unless we have a milking herd or a need to bring the animals back and forth to the barn every day or a couple times a day, really there's no need for lanes. And the best thing to do is plan for what the absolute minimum is with lanes. Even if you have dairy, more lanes everywhere, it's just you're losing your pasture acreage. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a better pasture. Gates at the end of the field can be any size, but my recommendation is to make them big enough for equipment. So if you're haying fields and you want to go around the end of the interior fence, you probably should put in 30-foot gates. It's just so handy to have the wide enough gates so you can get through their equipment. And also the gates facilitate cattle movement. So if you have gates at the end of your fields, you can go up and down the strips. You can move through from one strip to another. When you finish a strip, you can skip a strip and move over to the other one and do more like a figure-8 pattern. Kind of gets you through a circle so that when you're done at the end, you come back and you go back to the strips that you skipped, and you're back to the center again. The whole thing is, if you don't have lanes, you've got to do circle grazing. You got to get animals back. You got to get animals back to the starting paddock where you began. It's very important to make cattle movement and cattle facilitation as easy as possible. The producer is not going to accept your grazing plan. They're not going to like your grazing plan if they have to move cattle large distances over large grazed paddocks all the time. So you want to make sure that you've planned your system for the easiest cattle movement possible. This is the biggest problem I see with some of our people doing grazing layouts, pasture layouts, is they don't understand cattle flow and they don't bring those cattle back, or anything, livestock flow, whatever kind of livestock, doesn't necessarily be cattle, but just don't make it so there's a circular pattern to bring those animals back to the barn or back to the beginning pasture. Gates placed in center of long runs can also improve management. So for example, you get down a strip and you see that the strip next door is growing faster and needs to be grazed. So you move them in the middle. You move them over to the next strip in the middle of the pasture. So it's a good idea to put plenty of gates in, especially if you're doing cattle movement without lanes. I'll give you some examples and show you some thoughts on this with some actual layouts that I've done. Again, we're going to talk about, make your fields larger units. It can be subdivided into paddocks, and this really gives you that flexibility. Now, shade paddocks. Everybody seems to be worried about shade within livestock. The main thing is that, yes, you can have shaded paddocks. The thing is, you don't want paddocks that are open and have shaded areas. If you're going to put them in a shaded area, you want a consistent canopy of shade everywhere so that the grazing is going to be distributed pretty well. So, for example, if you have a woodlot and it's thinned out, or maybe consider thinning it down to 30% canopy, that may be an excellent shade paddock to put it in. If you've got a small woodlot area that you can fence and you can put them in for a few hours, you're in the middle of the day, a day like today where the humidity is up there around 60-70%, just getting those animals off the open pastures and into the shade will really help. But again, it's critical that we make sure the shade is very uniform throughout the pasture area you're going to. So yes, shade is important, especially on days like today, but have those pastures ready that give good, adequate shade. Now here's an example of a layout, and what I want to show you on this layout is how you group soils and how you match them to the layout of the field. This is a beef farm that we did a layout for. I did a layout for not too long ago in northeast Wisconsin. On the left, you can see the soils map, and these soils are color coded according to available water capacity or just drainage. So the very, very bright green soils are poorly drained or very high water capacity with high water tables. The purple and lighter colored soils are well-drained soils and have a steeper slope to them. So they're basically very, very productive, very well-drained soils. And then down here in this red area, this is what we call our group 10 soil, which is organic soil. It's saturated much of the year. and it's really what you would call, probably it gets down to our wetland areas. So as if you can see how we put our fences in here, this, if you can see my cursor, was the existing pasture right here. So we actually left that existing pasture. We increased the pasture to go up here to include this other wet area up here. We probably could have moved this fence. We probably could have put this fence line a little bit further north. As you see, there are some wetter soils along here. As you see, some poor production on these cropland fields. So we probably could have. This is the lane that comes from the corral in the area here. So as far as a circular pattern, there's a lot of opportunities for that. You can start here in these better drained soils, and you can move through. These red lines are the your single strand interior fences with gates at the ends. The blue lines are your pipeline areas. So you could see, you could rotate through very nicely in a circle method through these pastures around and come back to the beginning. You do have a lane right here in case you need to get back to the barn, but you can circle through there. If these areas are too wet, you can avoid them and circle. You can circle back through with the lane and a crossing and avoid those areas there. So what we've done is we've tried to make it the layout so that those areas in the higher ground can be grazed without having to graze the lower ground. And if in the spring some of the pastures get ahead of them, they can take each one of these units, for example, right here, and they could hay this unit and very easily get in and out there and take this equipment back down through the lane back to the barn. So this is what I wanted to show you, was how the layout really matches the soils on the farm. This is a small beef operation. Probably, I believe we have a total of about 30 acres, suitable for about 15 to 20 pairs, cow-calf pairs. Here's another example. This is using lanes for dairy operation. This is an organic dairy farm that we set up. They were conventional dairy and wanted to increase the number of acres of pasture on their farm. So this is the existing pasture right down here. They always had, but they wanted to bring in some more acres on the farm for pasture. So what we did is we made a plan to convert this area of cropland down in here and keep the existing pastures. Existing pastures were pretty much left as dry cow heifer pastures. This one right here in pasture number 6 was not broken up too much, but it was left more as is, as just a dry cow heifer pasture. And the dairy cows would be grazing some of these better areas. As you see, we have a lane that comes down and gives access to this old cropland area down here that now is becoming a pasture, in this cropland area here. And so again, if you need to hay any of these strips, these are pretty hilly soils. So these are actually old strips. You can see strip cropping. You need to hay those. They have those there, and you'll see like a daily allocation for the animals with polywire up here. So each strip would be grazed separately. There's no need for a lane down here because animals would just be moved to the next pasture. A back fence could be possible to keep them in there if they they know where the fresh forage is, they're going to go there, and they're not going to continue to back graze on the old areas. So you would just put before they go out, you would give them a new area with new fresh pasture, and then you would, once they get out there, you put a back fence up, and then when you're going to let them out, you would bring them back to the barn, back on the when they come back to the barn, they know there's something there for them. Usually there's some kind of supplemental feed. They're going to get going and go back over the grazed area. So notice some of the existing pasture won't be grazed as intensively, but because we have other acres now that we've incorporated into the system, we could give these areas a break that have previously kind of been overgrazed. So the red line is your perimeter fence that we're going to install. The black line is the interior fence, and then the temporary fences are the daily allotments, or actually, it might actually be allotments per each milking. Usually with dairy cows, you would give them a new pasture after every milking. Here's another small dairy that we worked with. As you can see, we have larger pastures that are further subdivided. So here we have the barn, and we have the milking parlor. We have a barnyard, and we have a lane here. This lane gives access to every field, every pasture area. And then we further subdivide these areas with front and back fences. And for pipelines, for some reason, I guess we don't have the pipelines here, but the pipelines would go down the center. They would go down the center of between the two pastures, between the two pasture allocations. So it'd be one here, there'd be one down the center here, and one over here. The pipelines would follow the lane as well, and this area would also be subdivided. So this is a dairy operation, probably for about between 50 and 80 cows for this operation. Smaller operations, but pretty much grass operations with probably a certified organic for a value-added product, either an organic or a grass milk organic product. Here's a farm that was a dairy, and quite a few number of acres, about 200 acres. I don't have the soils map to show this, but if I put the contour map on here, there would be a lot of lines. This farm is a very hilly farm in the southwest Wisconsin. The farm location is all located down here on the bottomlands. This whole area is part of a riparian area or creek system that comes down through here. Here's the creek. This is a flat field on the bottom, and the farm is on the bottom. There's over 120 feet of elevation from this barn to the top of this hill, which is up here. So basically, we are having to establish a well, to establish a whole pressurized. There is power going up there as well from the barn up the hill. We're going to establish a well, which is right here. This is actually a winter water. Establish the well, which is going to feed this upper layer of animals, beef animals. There won't be dairy anymore because this is converting to a beef farm. So there'll be two herds. There'll be an upper herd and a lower herd because of the difference in elevation. And there is a lane going up through here, but it's very steep, and just decided to go with two different herds on this farm. As you see, most of the fields are pretty good size, but with daily allocations, you can see the dash lines. Those are the daily allocations, or actually these are 3-day moves. So 3-day moves, approximately 3 acres that they would have. So for this 10-acre hay field, you'd have 3 divisions, probably for paddock 14, 4.8 acres, you'd have just one pasture, and so on and so forth. So, and how this works is that there really isn't any lanes either, but there would be a circular system that could be used to do this. You would come through here, come around, and you would come back to the beginning. This is where it would be your beginning area. So you would just swing around in a circular pattern here, here, go up around and come down. So that's kind of the circular pattern for the above herd. The lower herd would for the most part would start here, would go up in these paddocks, go through this paddock, come down through these trees, and come into this bottom paddock and go through these bottom paddocks. There is a crossing in here, and come over here, back to these pastures, and then down back on this lane across to begin again up on these upper pastures. So kind of a circular pattern. Seems to work pretty well now that this system has been installed. Okay, we do have a soils map on this next one. This next one was a conversion of cropland and steep ridgeland down in southwest Wisconsin. Again, you can see this was a crop field. We had a lot of strips. We had strips on this field, and here's the ridge top. All these side areas are kind of draws going down to the creek on the bottom. So pretty rough piece of land. But the producer wanted to expand the beef acres. This is where the existing pasture was. Notice we have a creek going down through there and a creek over here. So they wanted to expand it and put some more pairs here. So what we did is we left the existing pasture as is. Actually, we split it in two, and then up on top, we took a fence, single strand electric, right down the ridge line, and divided our paddocks off from that. For each paddock was, I believe, was about 4 acres, I think, for a 3-day move. And these fence lines, for the most part, would be temporary fences, more or less for the flexibility of being able to harvest as well. If you need to do some haying, you can take out a couple of these fences and hay in those. So for example, if you wanted to say take out an area like this, you could hay that area for a while for the first cut and then bring them back through. So the flexibility is allowing them to get machinery in there and to be able to hay. So the main backbone fence right here is what they work around with their poly wire and their fencing. Again, it goes according to the soils. These areas here are down on the bottomlands, and they are grazed as different areas than this more productive, flatter fields here up top. I wanted to give you an example of a pasture layout that doesn't work. And you see, sometimes you see this kind of what they call the wheel spokes pasture system, where you have the water in the middle and you have animals that move around the outside. You know, it sounds like a good idea, but what really doesn't work in that really animals need a square area to be in, because if they don't, they tend to graze differently in one area than another. So if they have a long, narrow area, such as this area here, and the water is up here, they're going to really beat the area down near the water tank. And they're going to be grazing a lot less frequently towards the end of this. So these kind of systems I wouldn't recommend. Sometimes you see them and people think, well, this is going to work real well because then I can just open up the gates and move them around. But what we want to really have is a square pasture that works the best. It works for the most uniform manure distribution and uniform grazing distribution. So you don't have overgrazed areas and undergrazed. And really, you're wasting your forage when you do that. Okay, let's talk about layouts for pastures during the winter. Now, what we're talking about here is winter management. You know, animals, beef animals, or if you're not milking them, are very agile about being outside all winter. And it actually saves you a lot of expense in manure hauling and labor to have animals outside bale grazing. So what we want to do is when we consider winter management, winter grazing, or animals out on pastures with bales to graze on or laid out with hay swaths, you know, sometimes you don't necessarily give them a bale feeder with a bale, a round bale, but you might lay out a swath for them to graze. We want to make sure we locate those in good areas. We want to locate winter feeding areas in high and dry areas. And we also want to locate the watering facilities in those same places. So we're not going to probably haul water from the barn every day in a cold day. So you want to be able to have some kind of winter facility or winter water out there that they can use. So the main thing is take advantage of your terrain. Only do your bale grazing on your best fields, on your highest and most well-drained fields. Don't be winter grazing down by the creek or down in your wetter sites. Also for mud season. Mud season is the time of year when after the surface thaws out, the snow is gone, but you don't have enough dryness. Anytime they go out there, they're going to ruin the vegetation, and you're going to have mud. There are a time of the year where you are going to have a sacrifice paddock or an area where they're going to have to be in the mud. And that way you aren't going to be hurting your pastures, your most productive pastures. This is a good time where you'd have a dry lot or heavy use area pad, a concrete pad to put them on. And I know in Wisconsin that occurs usually during March and first part of April. There's probably 4 to 6 weeks of mud season that we have to plan for, and we have to have a place for them. Could be a bedded pack, could be a barnyard, it could be just an area of crop field where you're going to be doing some tillage. You can have them in that area, feed them hay, just as long as it's well drained. And if you don't have any shelters near those areas, you could also think about bringing in portable shelters if you need it to keep them out of the wind. It's important that animals have shelter from the wind, especially on wet days, and especially when you have a lot of there's nothing worse for an animal than to be wet and cool from the wind. And especially if it gets really below zero weather and you don't have any windbreak, you want to think about getting them in an area where there is a windbreak, as long as it's maybe up against the woods, the forest, but as long as you've got frozen conditions or it's good dry places for them to be. So those are really important. I was thinking of giving you some pictures of some good wintering sites. I didn't really have any. So you've all seen dry lots. I will show you an example of giving a map to a producer in the grazing plan and showing where the best wintering areas would be. So now we're going to look at some other examples. So I'm going to stop sharing and pull up some more examples.
Hey, one thing you were talking about the size or the shape of these pastures. kind of a rule of thumb that we use here is, if you can't keep them to square, probably don't exceed a 4-to-1 ratio, 400 feet long by to 100 feet wide. If that's going to be your full pasture. Now, if you're going to subdivide that, then that's a different situation. Then you're not exceeding that. So just wanted to add that bit of information.
That's a good point, Matt. As you get really long and narrow like that, and if you can actually say 4-to-1, that's a really good ratio. I think anything less than that will work real well. So good point on that. So first thing I'm going to show you is another one with big fields, long fields, where we're dealing with a beef operation that can be a circular pattern again throughout the farm. So here is basically the buildings, corral, the dry lot. So we can move around each one of these pastures. The daily allocation is a pasture. Through there, we would divide it with the poly wire and move throughout. We do have to cross the road. So once we get over here, we'll want to be doing a circle movement throughout these fields, and then come back again, cross the road, and get back into this what we call a exercise lot or the barn area. So sometimes it's helpful to put on the maps for the producer, kind of the circular pattern. And this is what I sometimes do, is put the pattern through there. So this is just across the road. If you were just if you had a different herd across the road, say across the road is the cow-calf herd, and on the other side is the stockers, or vice versa. I think this actually was a stocker operation. They would start here at this barn, move into here, move around the line, and then you could see where they would need crossings to get to these different pastures. And then they would use the poly wire to break these down. These would be the allocations that they would have. And they would take their animals through the gates and move them up and down the strips like that. Now, I did talk about the figure 8 pattern, and this is kind of like the figure 8 pattern, except that if you just have a square area here and you want to go from here back over to here, what you could do is you could skip each strip. So we come to the end of this strip, raise that up a little bit, make this a little bit smaller. So you come up to this strip, and instead of going back down here and here and here, then you have to get back over to here. You could go to this strip here, and then actually you would go to this strip down here, come back over here, come up here, skip back over here, and this would bring you back to this one. So that, let's say, for example, when you get over here, you're done. You have to go back over two strips to get to the beginning one again. If you do the figure 8 like so, you only have to go through one gate to get back over to here. It's by skipping a strip. That's what I mean by the figure 8, to be able to do that. Sometimes that works better to get you back through to the beginning again with the animals.